very warm welcome to you all. Welcome to Designing Cities for All.
The 2-year activity program of Pakhuis de Zwijger,
in which we take a deep dive into designing products,
places and systems for all.
At every level, we can see certain communities being marginalized, being taken advantage of, and it's all part of the design.
When you're neurodiverse, you're in a world that isn't designed for you.
We're not the only species on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
The city needs to be also a city for the other species.
And we need to do something because the old structures in which we worked don't work.
Things won't change just if we just let things happen.
Instead of saying, what can we do to mitigate the impacts? We need to start asking ourselves, what is causing that?
Design is political, that we need to design processes, that we are all different, but there are things that unite us.
These are the things that need to be on the table, that need to be recovered in order to redesign the society.
Everything around us was once designed and can therefore be redesigned.
How do we teach design in a way where students can be really critical of the systems of power that have informed and dominated design?
Inclusion happens by design or not at all.
I think it's always some kind of a co-creation process, and you have to make very little steps and then figure out together what works and what doesn't.
it takes as much time to do something good as it takes time to do something bad.
All design tells a story.
But there's also a bit of a need to not just write ourselves into the past, but also kind of write ourselves into the future.
I invite you so much to join my path of liberation, and I'm hopefully being welcomed by your path of liberation.
We have to heal collectively. We have to help each other understand some of these constructs that actually divide us.
Not fitting in was a blessing, or I would have turned out just like you.
Good evening, everyone. There's one person in the back who knows how it's done. Can we do that again? Good evening, everyone. There we go. That was a video that showed the wrap-up of the first 2 years of Designing Cities for All, which is a research and activities program that takes a deep dive into designing products, places, and systems for all. In 2023 and 2024, Designing Cities for All will explore the concept of regenerative design. And this will be done together with 6 fellows and many designers and storytellers and artists and scientists and other experts that we can find to talk about this. And the aim is to learn more about how we can redesign the world in a way that recovers and strengthens the systems in it so that people and everything beyond the human can bloom. I always find that idea of it blooming a really beautiful thing, and it makes you think of spring, which is very far away at the moment, but we'll get there eventually. Before I welcome the speakers, I want to welcome the audience that is sitting in this room, but also the audience that is joining us online. You may have noticed that the setup is a little different tonight. You're part of an experiment at the moment to further involve the audience in the conversation that we are having. Tonight, the aim is to hear more about your perspectives and not just invite you to join the conversation, but at times actually lead that conversation. So get ready to provide some input. So we're not sitting separated from the audience as we usually are, but we've tried to create a circle where we are a bit more integrated in the audience and sitting at the midst of you instead of in front of you. Now, I'm curious, who was here last episode? Okay, great. Did any of you guys provide any questions in the last episode? I see one hand coming up. Okay, be ready to contribute tonight. We'll ask a lot of questions. There's a lot of moments to speak and to talk up. Tonight is the second episode of a 3-part series called Reimagining Borders, developed by Designing Cities for All fellows Joris, Lechêne, and Lucia, Kula. You may clap. Together, we're going to be delving into the concept of made-up boundaries, borders, binaries, and their implications on the world. We'll explore how dualisms influence our public spaces and the systems and histories that we have by talking about the relationship between power structures and physical structures. And in today's episode, we'll be looking at the concept of desire paths together with our 2 speakers, Barbara Oliveira Soares and Ilke Gers. The program tonight is divided into 2 rounds. During each round, we'll discuss a certain question or subject at hand. I'll first ask you guys for your opinion on that subject or that question. And once we've gathered enough, we'll show a video, because we managed to get input actually beyond the borders of this room, but reaching as far as Brazil and Iran and even Zambia, I think, which is kind of cool if you ask me. And during each round, after we've spoken with each other, after we gathered information from the audience, we'll have a conversation between the four of us to dive further into the topics and kind of figure out how each one of you has something to do with that topic and what your unique point of view on that is. But first, I want to pose a question to the audience. Seeing as I just spoke about audience participation, let's start right there. I've got a picture. Actually, I'm messing up the order of this. My apologies. For the people at home, we've got a Mentimeter. So we've got audience input from the people sitting around us, but also you at home can contribute to this, to the conversation that we're having here. If you want to do that, please go to menti.com. And you should be able to see the code somewhere on your, I don't know where it is, somewhere on your screen. And on menti.com, you can fill in the code 11934224, and then you will be able to join the conversation. I've got an iPad over here that will pop in your questions to me when I need them, and I will be looking at it. So if you see me looking at the bottom right, I'm trying to figure out if you guys are asking us questions. For the people in the room, just stick up your hand, and we've got two amazing people who will be bringing out the microphones. They will pop out from different corners. Domi's over there, and Romi's over there, and Romi's over there. So I just did a whole speech about having a conversation. Let's start with an actual conversation. I've got a photo of an intersection in Japan. That should show up somewhere. There we go. And I'm very curious what you think about this intersection the moment you see it, what your first impressions are, and how you would get from A to B on this intersection. Anyone have any ideas? How would you navigate from A to B? Zebra crossing, yeah. So I'm hearing over here that the shortest route will be the zebra crossing. Anybody else would take that route? Okay, there's like a run and hope for the best. I think that's a good strategy. What are your? Why would you run and hope for the best? Why is that your first impulse? There's a microphone coming. Give me 1 second.
Because I think looking at this, I'm getting confused to like what the system is expecting me to do. So then I will just go with my instinct, which is to take the shortest route. And then if in that time a car is coming by, that's why I'm running and hoping for the best. And I think also like just growing up in a big city, like I'm from Istanbul, so like I feel like in places like this, I just indeed run and hope for the best.
Your city savvy kicks in.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice. Now I'm curious. We also have another intersection. It's an intersection in Tehran. And again, the same question, what are your first impulses when you see this, and how would you go from A to B? I think one thing that's good to note is that there's a border around A and also a border on the street side of B. I see a hand coming up. There's a microphone on its way.
I see on either side there's like something inclined. I'm thinking there's maybe like a staircase that could go, there's a passageway underneath.
Mm-hmm. I think you're actually right, not to give away too much, but there is indeed, on both sides, there's a metro entrance that you could go underneath. Who else in this room was like, ooh, I'll take a staircase? No one. Oh, I see one person who did, yes. What do you want to do?
Oh, I would take a staircase.
You would take a staircase?
Yeah.
Who had another solution, or who would have done this differently? I see a hand going up over there.
Yeah, I would just climb over the barricade.
And then run and pray for the best.
I don't see many cars, like only one police car, I think, in the middle. So if you run fast enough, the police car also can't get through the barrier, so...
True.
Yeah.
Good point.
Like the other lady said, make a run for it.
Nice.
Yeah, it looks like some people tried, because I see people crossing, unless they're police officers. But yeah, it looks like some people didn't care about the barriers.
I see one person wearing a helmet and then one person not wearing a helmet, and I guess that's police officer and a barrier crosser. Anybody else had any other ideas or impressions? I can
Yeah, I thought you could relatively easily walk past the barrier, so walk around, and that there's kind of a traffic light that will help you get across as well. That's also what I thought the person crossing the street was doing, like walking past just the street crossing you're supposed to use.
I'm curious, what are the main differences between these two photos, the one of Japan and the one of Tehran? Or is there anything that anybody notices between the two? I see a hand going up. There's a mic on its way. Thank you, Domi.
The first one tries to provide some information on ways you can access it, and the second one has no information for people.
Clear. Nice. Joris.
I find it interesting as well that there doesn't the zebra crossing that doesn't seem to be where most people walk. It's almost like they're avoiding it between A and B, and I don't know why, because that's not even the shortest route that they're taking. But they're doing an ellipse. Why?
I'm cheating a little bit. So I have a first-hand video that I took in May when I walked down here, and I don't have it on my phone, otherwise I would have provided it. But a lot of people actually, so at the ends there's massive crowds, so a lot of people actually come in from the far right, for example, and like swoop through the center to get to the other side. So where you think it might be straight lines, it's honestly all over the place where you're crossing there. But somehow it works, which I find fascinating. I've got a few more photos of different paths, and I'm curious, just by show of hands, who has walked down paths like these? Nice. So these paths are paths that we call desire paths, and that's not a grammatical error. There is no D after desire, which I had to Google because I thought that was an issue. It's desire paths, and they're basically paths that people take that work better for them. One person used the term voting with your feet, which I find very interesting. And we're going to talk a lot more about this tonight with our guests. Now, I'd like to start with Joris and Lucia. Welcome back. So I'm curious, like I said, we're talking about desire paths. Joris, what made you guys want to highlight this concept tonight, and how does it relate to demands versus desires?
Well, because that speaks on the relationship between the space and the individual. Even with the same space, we all have a different experience of the space. We have a different way of moving through the space that will be dependent on our identity, our body, our abilities, but also our culture, our gender. All of that will impact the way that we perceive the space and that we move through the space, the way that we feel authorized to move through the space or not, how comfortable we feel in the space and in moving, in following the infrastructure, the design, following the formal path that has been designed for us, or ignoring it. So all of that will be determined by the person, the individual. So that was a very interesting reason. And also the other reason is that it's also a way of seeing society. It's, do we think that design should serve the user, or that the user should follow the design? Because all of those desire paths, they come from a situation where the design, the intended paths, does not provide what the users want. It seems that the user all want to go in a certain direction, and there's no path, there's no pavement. So that's how they appear. It's a collective will to do something that isn't provided by the infrastructure, by the system, by the space. So that says a lot about our society as well. That's why I thought this was a very interesting topic.
Nice. So I mentioned earlier, this is the second episode that we're having. The first episode was Trends and Traditions. And I'm curious to see how do these two relate to each other?
Yes, thank you. It was very interesting. So
Wait, 1 second. Could we get sound on Lucia's microphone? I think it's on. It should be on. Give it another go.
Yeah? No?
Okay, go for it.
Yes, okay. So when Joris and I were thinking about the topics for the series, we were talking about particularly some of the conversation that Joris already has on his platform. And I wanted to draw it a little bit on a larger scale on what I teach. So I teach law, and particularly law from a post-colonial theory perspective. So I look at the intersection of law and colonialism, and I look at how we as people navigate spaces, including borders. And when we're talking about desire paths, Jory asked the question about how does this translate to your work? And I was like, actually, on a larger scale, you can look at colonial infrastructure. That desire paths can be drawn on a bigger scale, right? You see where people who have been displaced by colonialism and then either come back to the city or are brought back to the city, create spaces that are not necessarily designed for them through their own ideas of the making of the community. And that can be through informal settlements, right? And that includes creating paths and infrastructures that are not made by the state or by an entity. And therefore, the desire is there to build a community that functions and works in a way that presents them with their ideal or imaginative version of what the community should function as. And this was for me an important way of looking at desire paths on a larger scale, but also actually to draw the connection between how we as people navigate spaces around policies and bodies and restrictions that are created for us.
Oh, that's really interesting. So it goes far beyond the idea of, oh, here's a muddy path, but actually reflects in everyday life.
Yes.
Nice. I'm curious. So we have an audience here, and all of you saw this page at some point and went, I'm going to sign up and show up to this. I'm very curious what you're hoping to learn tonight, and if there's maybe any questions that we can then specifically answer over the course of this episode. So what were you guys hoping to learn by coming tonight? You can stick up your hand, and a microphone will find its way to you.
Learn or share with the rest of the audience, with us, with the community.
See a hand going up there?
So I was hoping to learn more about how Europe is very old, so the desire paths are mostly the paths that we use. Sometimes that lead to problems like roads being busy, but in towns and cities that are developed later or by other people, I was hoping maybe to learn something about how the desires of the local people who live in a city that was not made for them or made by other people for other people, how the desire paths changed the city. I know the example of in Kenya there was the railroad that was used for shipping all the raw materials, and now they needed a railroad to connect the cities for passengers, but they couldn't because the railroad led somewhere else, so that the whole system was different. So I was hoping to learn something about that.
Nice. I think we have a really cool example of this coming up later.
Yeah, that's interesting because that's how we're gonna probably end the conversation today. So yes, put a pin on it.
Yeah. Any other things that you guys wanted to learn or share? I see a hand going up over here.
I'm a bit curious if policymakers actually take these desire paths seriously, and are they actually doing something about that? I'm curious.
I'm really happy you asked that question. Do we know about this? Do we know about responses from policymakers to desire paths?
In essence, in some cases they do. So one of the ways that, for example, when a city is designed or when a neighborhood is designed, you get some kind of input from local communities. It's not to say that everything that is fed back is actually also implemented, but the idea of desire paths actually it's about those things that do not come into plan, right? That are not accepted into the official structures. Everything that is accepted is something that has been either communicated and desired and therefore accepted already, because there's some kind of alliance between this is what a community needs and this is what a community will use. But then what comes after is the realization that actually, okay, to get, for example, from point A to B, we've actually created another barrier that we didn't foresee, right? So how do people then vote with their feet? How do they create other ways to get to point B? The idea behind creating policies that are responsive to what people need is not necessarily what we see in a system where we are now. We don't all get to vote and say, okay, I want the world to look the way it looks, because otherwise we'd all have a very inclusive space that is considerate about abilities, mobilities, and all of these things. And unfortunately, they're not. Even when we make considerations, for example, around mobility and accessibility, it's not with people who have those needs in mind. It's actually around what is possible with the restrictions that we have.
So that you still end up with some barriers.
Exactly. So you would, for example, design an elevator or a pathway that doesn't fit all wheelchair users because you have one specific type of wheelchair in mind. Or you'll have doors that don't open a certain way but open from the other side, for example, but then don't necessarily cater to someone that uses a cane. So it is about making considerations around who is able to speak up at a certain point, and those who haven't spoken up usually are the ones that then create the design paths that other use, right? So there was one person that made that first step to actually choose to use the other way, and then someone else followed behind that.
Which is interesting, because when I see these photos of the mud paths and the trails running through it, I don't think a lot of people consider the fact that there's actually an entire group of people who can't take that mud path, who would love to, but couldn't. And my first response with your question, my brain goes, just pave it. Like, people are walking there anyway. The grass is not going to be growing back. Like, throw a pavement over it so that everybody, or at least more people, can make use of that path.
And there are two possible attitudes from the authorities. Is either considering that, well, people have to follow the law the way that we intended it. So the example that I used on TikTok was there was initially a barrier, but there was a hole in the barrier, and that turned into a desired path because that was very practical for people to go through there. But instead of taking that as data and thinking, well, the people are telling us that they want to go this way, so let's accommodate for that desire, for that need, they just repaired the barrier. So just following, this is not supposed to be this way, so you're going to walk that way, and we said so. So that's unfortunately the attitude. Of course, there are many other considerations. They might say, well, that path is not safe, or we can, and usually the pushback that we hear a lot is, oh, well, if we're not going to pave over every single, there would be no parks, there would be no grass, no green space, because everybody would be going their own way. But the desire path themselves, they show that it's not true, because that only happens when collectively everybody who not everybody, but the majority of the people who use the space want to go the same way. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a trail, there wouldn't be a path. So that is the manifestation, the physical manifestation of a collective desire. So it's not individual it's the opposite.
And honestly, that path is a lot smaller than the path that's running right next to it, which I find interesting. Also joining us tonight are Barbara Oliveira Suarez and Ilke Gers. Welcome. It always makes me so happy when people clap at the right time without me having to mention it. Barbara, you studied urban and regional planning and are currently working as a researcher at the Urban Cycling Institute. Can you tell us more about your background and the topics and projects that you're working on at the moment?
Yes, so I'm an urban researcher who's interested in the intersections between justice, urban planning, and mobility. I currently work for Urban Cycling Institute. We're a research foundation that focuses on using cycling to identify different developments in the city, such as gentrification, spatial justice, to name a few. I'm completing a research fellowship there of 1 year where I'm working together with the municipality of Amsterdam to identify the barriers that people face to cycle. It's focusing on inclusion and equity. And looking at the different types of cyclists in the city as well as non-cyclists, and how we can develop more inclusive transport and mobility policies to make it more accessible and increase the chances and access to opportunities and services.
Amazing. For building a way to a better city. I like this. Ilke, you're a visual artist and you work on the ground with something called fragile materials. Now, I'm very curious, what are fragile materials and how do they help you explore the interaction between the human and the built environment?
Thanks. So maybe it helps to explain a little bit what I do first, and I can talk about the materials. So I make what I call installations, and they're groundworks the majority of the time. Here's an example. And essentially, what I'm trying to explore is the relationship between the body, movement, and language. And the way, what's interesting for me in that is that when you're an audience or the public or a viewer, you're also inside the work, so you're immediately implicated in it. And you can also move through it and navigate it and see it from different angles, choose a perspective, and at the same time that you never really see the whole thing at once. Sometimes you'll see images where it is from above, but essentially most of the time you kind of, and that's kind of also I think how we experience different places from your body. And secondly, I make this through moving, so it's always like using some kind of material or instrument where it's through my full body movement that I make these things. And it comes, the human, my mistakes and my whatever I do, I can't redo things, so they always stay with it. And in terms of fragile materials, here I'm working with chalk in this work as well. And it's because I use this chalk marker that's used for sports fields. And I became really interested in making, instead of just drawing with your hand or having these really isolated spaces, to really use your whole body where it becomes a more intuitive movement. And in a way, it was replicating road markings. There's this thing called screed marking in the UK, which is really interesting, where they use this thermoplastic paint that when it's heated up, it becomes liquid. And then when it goes on the ground, it cools down and solidifies. But how it works is sort of like a bucket where you pour this hot paint into, and then these workers move through the space to make language, so a stop sign or bus stop or something. But what's interesting is they basically creating this choreography for how transport and people in public are allowed to or instructed to move through space, but they do it through a sort of dance almost, this movement that they do it with. And I'm really interested in this interaction between making it and people using it. And I mean, what's nice about being fragile is that also the public can affect it. So and it doesn't last forever. I mean, nothing lasts forever, but this particularly has a often short time span. Sometimes I use things that last a little bit longer, but I've never done anything that's meant to last, right? And so, for instance, this work, the cars have driven over it, and and then this chalk spreads all over the city. And so this language, this attempt at making an alphabet, that doesn't really mean anything, but is the container for what we can have as language, is kind of destroyed. And that's probably enough for now.
Nice. I love this idea of dancing to create a choreography for the next person that will then move through that space. It's very, beautifully said and visually speaking. As I said earlier, we're going to be moving through rounds tonight. We've got 2 rounds. We're about to start with the first round. Again, for those joining online, you're able to provide your input through menti.com. If you go to menti.com, you can enter the code 1193 4224. You can see it on your screen at the moment. And then you can provide input and respond to the questions, and I'll make sure that I will look at your questions as they're coming in. For the people in the room, you can just raise your hand. A microphone will find its way to you, and then you can provide your input as such. The first question I have for the audience is, do you ever shortcuts that you're officially not supposed to take? I see someone going, have you got an example? Microphone is on its way.
So it's really not much of a shortcut, but if I leave my house, I usually have to go along this path that's next to a canal. Mm-hmm. And there's a footpath. It's a gravel path, and it's usually very muddy, and you don't really want to walk there. So I always go over the bicycle lane, like literally everyone.
So the bicycle lane's overrun with pedestrians at this point.
Yeah. And honestly, when I'm biking there, I don't care, because it's like, it's nicer to walk there than on the gravel path next to it. So
you get it. Anybody else have an example of shortcuts that they take that they're not supposed to take? A hand's going up right over here.
Hi, I'm from the US, and it used to be that it would take over 25 minutes to get to walk to the closest coffee place to us. And then we figured out that there was a path between 2 houses that we could take, but it kind of went through someone's yard, and that's always a little sketchy in America. But we used to cautiously take this path that kind of went beside someone's house. But all of this also made me think that in the States, sometimes the paths that we're taking don't show up as cute little spots that people are walking, but it actually ends up in fatalities and people getting really harmed because they don't have the access to sidewalks and paths at all. So it's really kind of a different signal.
So the lack of access becomes an actual safety issue.
Yeah, totally.
I find it interesting that you mentioned safety. This is an amazing bridge. We have a video from someone in Brazil who also mentioned safety.
Então, Joris, a gente está indo lá gravar o beco, que eu falei que seria o atalho para exemplificar, para dar como exemplo da sua fala, da sua palestra, do debate que você está levando. A questão é que, assim, a Rocinha, ela é uma favela e ela tem pouca presença do Estado e muita presença do poder paralelo. E o poder paralelo está espalhado pelo morro. Então, geralmente o beco que eu pego, o atalho que eu pego, sempre tem pessoas fortemente armadas lá. Então, primeiro eu vou dar uma olhada para ver como é que tá. E aí, se tiver ok, eu vou entrar para filmar. Senão, a gente vai escolher um outro espaço. Eu vou agora acessar um desses atalhos que existem aqui na Rocinha, que corta a Rua Janeia com a Estrada da Gávea, que é um dos principais, é o principal acesso, o principal meio de transporte daqui da favela. O nome desse atalho é Atalho. Então, que eu estava gravando uma fala que a gente tinha debatido que seria importante incluir no vídeo, mas a própria Gabi, né, Gabi? Cadê a Gabi?
Oi.
Gabi, que é cria aqui da Rocinha, nascida e criada na Rocinha, que conhece, entende bem como é que funciona, o que pode, o que não pode, me alertou dizendo: olha, acho que não achei legal você falar, inclusive, dessa coisa aí do poder paralelo, não. Para você ver o quão intimidador é esse assunto na comunidade. É um assunto polêmico, complexo, como as construções desse lugar.
Nice. Joris, you can give us a bit more context about this, right?
I don't know if everyone knows what a favela is, because yeah, it's basically a slum. So it's an informal neighborhood that, well, the word is favela in Brazil, but there's the equivalent in most places of the global majority. There used to be quite a lot also in Europe, but now they've been cleared. Now we have homeless people instead. But yeah, so and here, so the idea is, because it is very informal, everything grows up without the control of the state, not because they're really cool and they don't mind, but because they are not able to provide, or they don't care about the kind of population who finds themselves needing a space to live. So everything happens sort of haphazardly and without planning, and usually, because again the state is so absent, that means that universe hates the void. So there's always some sort of power that's gonna organize itself, and usually it's gang, it's drug cartels, which is negative in a way, but also they, in many occasions, they run the place better than the state would. So the money goes to bad places, but well, if you look at where this money, our tax goes to as well, it's not great either. So in a sense, yeah, it's a different it's a different type of organization, but there's always an organization, and that's something that people might not necessarily realize, is that even in marginalized areas, even in poor areas, there is always some systems, there is always organization, and what may look chaos from the outside, from the untrained eye, is actually, it can be very, very well organized, and sometimes it serves the needs and it accommodates the people better than a state might do.
Yeah. Nice, thanks for giving some more context. We had another hand go up when we were talking about examples. I think that was your hand. There's a microphone on its way.
So I live in London, and this was on my way to work, so kind of walking straight and needing to go around the corner, and obviously we've probably seen it in these pictures, our kind of instinct is to go diagonal. And in this case, it was kind of this big empty bit of kind of paved area in front of a council estate block, and around it had like a really kind of low brick wall, like maybe 2 or 3 bricks, and it had like an opening in the middle and an opening there. So to me, like, I just thought it was kind of natural that you just cross that way, and I kind of did it like almost every day going to work. But at one point I did see a resident coming out and kind of look at me weirdly, like, what the hell are you doing here? Which is kind of fair enough, like it's not my space, but that was just something I thought to share because it felt like really empty, not used at all. And
So was it someone's garden? Was it a private space? Or
no, it was just kind of the main entrance of the estate block, but it was essentially open without an actual kind of metal barrier, just a really small kind of.
Sounds like a very lavish entrance.
Yeah, it was a bit weird, but it's in like on a main road in London, and so.
Nice. Thank you for sharing. Did anybody else have any examples of shortcuts they weren't officially supposed to take? There's a hand going up here. I can reach over.
This isn't one you're not officially supposed to take, but it just, the idea of like safety and danger to do the shortcuts made me think, as a woman, like the number of times that I've experienced and that a lot of women have experienced in the daytime, like taking a shortcut through a park or down an alley. And whereas then the moment it's nighttime, knowing I definitely shouldn't be taking that shortcut because it then becomes a dangerous space. So yeah, it just made me think of that, and yeah.
Yeah, the map of the city, the built environment changes depending on, well, your gender, your identity, the time of the day as well. What is a short distance in the daytime can suddenly become a very long distance at night. Yeah, the notion of comfort as well changes.
I'm curious. I know that you did a research before on female safety in the city. Is this something that came up during that research as well?
Yes, definitely. I think, especially because my research was focused in the nighttime, it was particularly interesting to see how the built environment can affect the feeling of safety of women, and how, most of my respondents would avoid, for example, parks at night. My research was focused on Amsterdam, so for example, the touristic city center was also areas in which women felt unsafe at night, given the attraction of drunk tourists and predominantly male presence. So these factors really also affect the journeys that women decide to take, be it go through longer routes or routes with better lighting. So that's also interesting, and also an aspect that I think about. Maybe desire paths might not necessarily always be about the like shortcuts, but also different desires. So to have more safety, or to, for example, have more predictability. My research with on cycling also involved people with physical impairments. And there, they also mentioned the cycling lanes as a sort of fact, or like a space that they try to use instead of pavements for pedestrians, since they're more predictable, free of obstacles, and can serve as better infrastructure to move around the city. So, yeah.
Nice, thank you. Thank you for adding that. I find it a really interesting perspective to talk about, Lucia.
I just wanted to ask, particularly around the mobility. So when you have people who have a mobility impairment who use the cycle lane, did that in any way come up if they are welcomed in that space or not? If that is something that is also not only easier for them, but also for the others who have already ownership of that space, right? Because we tend to take ownership of spaces where we feel like this is where I am supposed to be and you're encroaching on my area.
Yeah, I think the interesting point there was also that a lot of the respondents would say that they prefer to use these spaces outside commuting hours, when they know that the city or the streets are less busy, and therefore, will be less have less of a potential of having uncomfortable interactions with cyclists. Specifically in Amsterdam, you also hear a lot that cyclists can be a bit hostile towards other space or road users, and so to avoid this sort of confrontations, they would prefer to move around the cycling lanes. Outside.
The reason why I ask that, sorry, just to interrupt, is because I live in London, and London is non-existent with cycle lanes. Well, they're getting there at some point. So I'm really curious to see how that desire pad is built into the idea of safety, particularly for people with mobility issues, because in London you're basically forced on the pavement, but no one wants you there. No one wants to see someone in a wheelchair on a pavement because you're basically an inconvenience, right? You have to move and you have to pay attention, and even when they see you, they don't want to move because you don't belong.
So they have nowhere else to run to, but
Yeah.
the space for them is also not really
Mm,
desired for, or
yeah.
doesn't desire them, which is even worse.
Exactly.
Interesting. Nice. Thanks for sharing that. Ilke, you've been working in and on public spaces a lot. You've got your project Desire Lines. I'm curious, how do you see this concept of desire path happening with Desire Lines and in the projects that you do?
This project in particular, called Desire Lines, which I did in 2021, is an NDSM wharf, which is in the north of Amsterdam. And so what's interesting about this space, it's a former shipyard. That's the shed in the background. And then you have this whole area around it. This is inside the shed. Essentially this whole area, pedestrians, cars, and bikes use the space, but there's almost no markings on the ground. And you can also park there, and there's parking meters and everything, but there's no indication of where everyone should go. And I was invited to kind of respond to this this context in and outside of the shed. And obvious. So what I do in most projects, I spend a lot of time observing the place first and seeing kind of how people move and behave. And I should have said currently this space is a cultural space. So it used to be this, it's this from the 20s to the 80s. It was like making the most ships, I think building the most ships in the world or something. And so it was really interesting to see how people in cars move. For instance, one car would park somewhere, and then everyone would park around them, So as long as the first one is made, the decision is made, then it happens. And there's certain habits, the connection between the water and the shed where people walk to and explore. And so kind of the proposal I made for this project is to make a sort of drawing. And I do this, it's kind of like between drawing and writing, it's like gestures that sort of reflect these kind of movements, but not map them out essentially, but also maybe suggest where people could go, where they might not go. But then what happens, because it's made out of chalk, which is like basically a powder that falls on the ground, as it's moved over, it's also disappears slowly. So it kind of plays with the thing. And here immediately kids destroyed it as soon as I started with, and which is kind of great. It puffs up and it's like this thing you can, artwork is often on the wall and you're not allowed to touch it, or it's this very thing that's separated from your experience. Maybe just you can look at it and the sense that you can, have an effect. And sometimes I do this inside museums or galleries. And then there's always this question, like how do you respond to this? Because obviously these are spaces that are often made for certain people only, or only certain people feel comfortable in. And, suddenly you're confronted with this thing that, are you careful, are you not? And I think not all my projects deal with this idea, but I think what is common in my work is that I'm really interested in, once it relates to, maybe immediately these lines, because they're on the ground as well, relate to some kind of instruction or information or suggestion of what to do. They confuse maybe a viewer, or maybe suggest something different because they're not linear, they're not symmetrical. They might interfere with what's there already. And often, sometimes this one may be a little bit more linear, but it's like maybe sports field, and sports fields are always this confrontational, symmetrical thing, this binary, confrontational setup, and you kind of expand these things, and maybe it opens up a different way of relating to a space.
Nice. I love that you mentioned museums, because I can imagine that, a space where traditionally you're not supposed to interact with art. I feel like there must be this massive society pressure of you can't touch the line. And I'm curious, how do these societal boundaries change the way we interact with desire paths?
Well, I just wanted to bounce off something that you said, or your work, because we are in a society where there's this association. Something that is good is supposed to last and not change, and so we don't build into what we make and what we create the idea that it's supposed to fade away. It's going to change. It's going to be affected by time. So I find it very interesting that you intentionally use materials that are going to either fade away or change, or as with the other example with people stepping on it, they take a little bit of it wherever they go. So that evolves, and I find that very interesting and a challenge to also our assumptions in Eurocentric societies where things are not supposed to change. We are pretending that aging is not a thing, change is not a thing, it's a sign of weakness. Because of our consumption, we're supposed to get exactly the same thing, and we're supposed to be able to consume it in the same way every time. So yeah, that's just something.
Yeah, I was just going to say this sense of like things being unfixed, right? And also chalk is a raw building material. So, you know, in a sense, I'm reflecting on this, you know, everything feels so fixed in our environment. Our language feels fixed, our buildings feel fixed, but someone's designed everything. Someone's sitting there and they have not designed it for everyone. And we can misuse it, you know, as users we can do things differently, but it's also nice. And I guess there's a hope that, you know, once you see these things, and I think especially language is something that I'm interested in, how it's always made and remade and given new meaning, and, you know, something that can be played with rather than always controlling us.
Nice. I'm curious, Lucia and Barbara, there's actually a question from online. How do we move forward into a space where we start fixing these boundaries, these desired paths not matching what we need?
I think one of the most important thing is by looking at what community is, right? So community building and responding to community needs. And when I say this, because it's actually bouncing back on what Joris just said, is this idea of being static, writing things into law. And it is very strange coming from a lawyer, like codifying things is the way society, well, Western society functions, but it also means that we are very limited in our thinking in that way, because we want to keep things in the way that they function the best. But it doesn't mean that it functions the best way for everyone. And you can see that in, for example, spaces that have been colonized, where we have codified laws and customs that were not supposed to be codified. We used to say that customary law, particularly in the context of Africa and Asia, for example, were living laws, right? They adapt themselves around what the community wants and what the community needs, and they respond to particularly how the community wants to resolve, because the issues were mostly around resolving to a space where community can come back together, right? So where the community can evolve beyond the point of contention. And when you codify things, you're looking at immediate static solutions that don't really move around with the needs of the people. And you can see that in infrastructure. You can see that in the way we create ideas around how a city is supposed to be built, right? We are mostly, for example, building up because we have the notion that there is no space to build around us, and therefore make the city available and accessible for everyone. But it also limits the idea of where you decolonize spaces for the purpose of actually creating a living environment, not just an environment that you survive in, right? You have to be you have to look at a space where we don't center the human body as the most important thing in creating a city. And that's unfortunately where we are, even in law. Legislation that we build around policies of how the city looks like is mostly centering the human body. We are in an Anthropocene space where human experience is the most important. We don't really think about the trees, we don't really think about the animals. And if we actually want to be in a post-human environment, we have to think about all of these things and how they connect with each other, including the desire of where we walk and how we respond to nature, for example.
Nice, that's interesting. I found this first round fascinating. We've gone from desired lines, or desired paths, my apologies, to magnetic paths, where it's like one person parks here, somebody parks next to it, to paths that you actually purposely don't take at a certain time, and to how this reflects into law and how we could possibly move on. Thank you for answering that question. It was a question that was actually sent in online, which brings me to round number 2. Again, for the people online, you can go to menti.com and enter the code that is on your screen, I hope, because I lost it. There we go. And enter the code 11934224. And in the second round, I'm actually more curious about what motivates people to take certain paths. So my question to the audience is, what is the reason that you take shortcuts, and what are your considerations? Now, we had a very great example in the first round of like, this path is muddy, I really don't want to walk over that. What are some other considerations that you take when taking desired paths? There's someone over here. Did you raise your hand? No.
Yeah, I have a very simple answer. I just
enjoy walking over grass. I just
Nice.
really love walking over grass rather than across pavement because grass is soft.
Mm.
It's green. I enjoy it. That's the short answer.
Nice. I like this. Any other considerations?
Hi, it's me again. The reason I take the shortcuts is because they're shorter, but also because it validates your feeling because people walked that path before, so you feel like, oh, I'm supposed to be going that way because other people do it too. Like in Holland, we have the saying, if one sheep crosses the dam, then the rest will
rest
follow. So it's really validates your, like, I was thinking the same thing.
Mm.
Yeah.
Does this mean that you're less likely to do this if you're walking in somewhere, you're like, honestly, it would go this way, but there isn't a path yet? Would you then not go?
Yeah, it holds me
Holds you
back.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Any other inputs? I see a hand go. Oh, I can have my back up.
Hi. So for me, very simple answer is also just it being really inconvenient to take the path that has been described. An example is when a while ago I rented a car and I had to drop it off in the middle of the night. There was no parking. There was parking only across the street. But to get to the other side of the street, I had to nearly walk a whole block around because there was no place to cross other than if you just walk straight to a pile of bushes. There was no path there, but there's also no reason for, well, there are bushes, so I can't really walk there. So it was a bit of a hassle getting through, but it did save me, well, I think 10 minutes or so of walking. So not only just distance, but also just the amount of time and effort that I'm putting into it is something that I do take into consideration.
For me, I think it increases the mobility, like the amount of places that you have reached to. If you choose to say stick to the design road that was built or the pavement that was built, and this can be used for any other examples as well, then you know where you're going, you know where you need to go. There is very strict definitions of how far, how you can go, but once you choose to get out of it, then you can do a lot more as well. You don't have to just use the desired path, but you can turn back or, add more to the entire journey.
Yeah, for me, it's also a matter of necessity. As we were talking about accessibility earlier, while I was coming here, I was not able to find disabled parking because all the parking spots were taken. So I just parked it anywhere on the curb somewhere because I don't have the time to drive around the city all the while I'm supposed to be here. So necessity is also a very large part of why it's not necessarily a shortcut, but not using the space as it's intended. Yeah. Yes.
Any other examples? You can pass. Oh, have you got that one? Oh, perfect.
No.
Does it reach? No. Here you go.
No, I sometimes don't want to take the shortest route, like shortcut, but like the more pleasurable one. I live right in the center. Well, we were today, and it's like the red light district. It's so busy that I sometimes rather walk around or find where there's less people or find more pleasurable. Also, some things you just want to see things you don't always see. So there's different reasons, I think. It's not always time, so not always short. That's what I wanted to add. Yeah.
Lucia?
Yeah, I just wanted to actually add to that because sometimes the issue of wanting to enjoy is a particular way of walking is something that we don't really consider when people have limitations in their mobility or how they navigate. I'm just thinking my own experience when I don't have visible. Oh, sorry. I don't have visible mobility issues, but when on days that I'm very tired, I have to take the longer route because then I can take the lift and then I can actually get to my destination safely. But I would rather take the shorter cut. I would rather be like, okay, I can take the stairs and it will just take me like 10 minutes less to get there. But then now I have to reroute my entire way of getting somewhere and not maybe also enjoy the environment more. So even the idea of desired paths also doesn't take into consider that everyone is going to be able to enjoy the same route or at least enjoy the same ability to say, oh, wow, as actually this way is much nicer to get to.
Get to.
Yeah.
Nice. And I would say that there's an underlying notion that yeah, underpins all of what I've heard, and that's the notion of comfort, because there's the gravel path there that nobody likes. So why is it still a thing? Why do planners still,
especially in
do
a
that?
wet country?
Yes. So that's uncomfortable. But comfort is not just how easy it is for our body to move it, but also how pleasurable it is, how nice an experience it is, so how stimulating it is. So not just for our physical senses, but also what we see. And that's where I found your work very interesting, is that it's also a matter of comfort, especially because you usually work in very big surfaces that otherwise would be boring, very uniform. So I think that this is also interesting. And you notice, for instance, on the street, in the reason why industrial areas don't feel comfortable, there's the notion of safety, but there's also the notion that, for instance, there can be very, very long buildings without windows, without interruption. It's just long, blind walls. And that's not comfortable. That's not comfortable to our eyes, to our bodies, because there's also no way to escape in case that we might need it. There's nothing stimulating. And so I find it interesting to tie up together the notion of visual comfort and physical comfort.
I love how you tied this together, because indeed I was hearing answers that kind of go in all directions, and not necessarily it having to be a shortcut, but comfort is what you're going for. I like this. Does anybody else have any examples? I think we have a video example so this is a video that responds to the first photo we saw earlier on about Tehran and the big crossing where the sides were marked off. And this is the alternative to going over that fence. It's coming. While it loads, so basically it's a video that shows that if you're not jumping over the fence, you end up in this very complicated... Oh, there you go.
Place that comes to my mind when it comes to shortcuts. So there was this very big and very crowded crossroad in the city center, which had an underground passage that could like connect every corner of the crossroad to each other. But I remember that the underground passage was very confusing, and it has like a lot of exits and enters. So many people, when they wanted to go from one corner to the other corner, they wouldn't use the underground passage, which was the official way. They would take a shortcut of jumping off the fences and go through the streets, and again jump off the fences on the other side of the street to go to their desired corner. This would save them a lot of time and also a lot of confusion, but it had like a lot of danger.
Which I find interesting, because here you're kind of fighting different aspects of comfort with each other, right? So it seems relatively uncomfortable to climb a fence like this. That's pointy and there's a street on the other side. But I guess people balance that out against how uncomfortable it is to get lost in an underground tunnel.
Well, yeah, there's a notion of comfort that we don't often consider, is the way that our brain is wired. And something may feel comfortable, not necessarily for physical reasons, but just because we have evolved to want to go from A to B doing this. We are bodies, we are not cars. We are not meant to move through tunnels, even though it is physically possible, but it will never be a more attractive and comfortable option for human beings to go under a tunnel, down, tunnel, back up, than to go straight. And even sometimes when it's clearly dangerous, and it might even not be physically comfortable, it might take longer, but there's always going to be something in our brain that tells us, I'm in A, I need to go to B, I need to go this way. And so now that it's a fact, we can either take that into consideration and respect people and the way that we think. We are animals and we think in a certain way, or we can be come from a place of authority and decide, well, no, it's not convenient. The cars are the priority, for instance, so people will go underground. That never works. It's always And even if it works because there's no other option, it's always an uncomfortable experience.
Because this is prettier. And honestly, it's way easier for a car to go through a tunnel than for a person to climb stairs, go up ramps, end up sweaty. I don't know if you guys experienced the weather of the past few days, but I dressed way too warm. I came out of a tunnel looking a mess. So I would love for this to change. Barbara, you've done research before in the experience of safety. We shortly mentioned it earlier. Are there aspects of safety and consideration in that space that we haven't discussed yet?
Yeah, so to talk about my research, I wanted to introduce the topic. So it's the research on safety of women in the nighttime, and by studying the journeys to and from the nightlife. What I thought was interesting was the role also of how women thought that their own identity would be perceived in the movement through public space. So, for example, racialized women, queer women would be very aware of how they would potentially be targets of violence whilst they would move throughout specific spaces at night. When we think of safety considerations, of course, we talked about lighting. I think the idea of mixed-use planning, so thinking about making areas that combine residential with commercial as well as recreational spaces is important to kind of diversify the use of the space throughout night and day, and make diversify also the users that are present in the space as well. And I think what my research also uncovered was the importance of participatory processes. So what was previously mentioned about community building and involving communities in planning, but also institutionally. So not only by having one discussion round a year where you invite different women or different people with different identities to participate in these discussion rounds, but also actually encouraging more planners with different backgrounds to actually be to join the workforce. Also thinking about how the policies are created. I think in general you notice that planning practices still have a long way to go when it comes to also developing more inclusive planning practices.
Well, I have a question for you, actually, because there's the feeling of safety or unsafety, but there's the reality. And I was wondering if there was a correlation between the areas where people, and more specifically women, tended to feel unsafe, and the areas where there was actually more crime or more attacks. Did it tend to be the same places, or was there a discrepancy there?
Yeah, so some of the photos showed some of the maps that I used to map out these experiences. So I asked the users to map out areas that they would avoid at night. You can see them in the circles. As you can see, the Vondel Park, for example, was highlighted. So it's a big park in Amsterdam, but also more touristic city centers. And that is typically also where women, or the most cases of harassment, are experienced and reported according to the municipality. To some extent you would see correlations. Then again, some areas, for example, more isolated areas, like you mentioned before, big industrial areas, sometimes were also mentioned, even though there you might not necessarily have this correlation. So yes and no.
I love that you mentioned the factories, because I never stood still to think about the fact that there aren't people there. So why do I feel so unsafe in a space like that? But nice. I find it curious how there's a whole concept of desire paths and places you go to and places you avoid are a response to a very fixed environment. Ilka, how does your work destabilize that fixed environment?
Well, I guess what I'm trying to do is, make things that these things that I do not fit necessarily into the environment. And I guess when you come across them, or when they present in different spaces, they, for instance, this one was at South Bank Centre at London, and here they sort of game-like floor works, but there's simple instructions for them, but the whole intention is that they can be used in different ways. And the idea is that it's this open thing that people can respond to how they want to. I always feel like any kind of set thing that you tell people to do is going to fail, as we see with desire lines. Obviously, things need to be designed in certain ways through planning and things like this to include people, but it doesn't. Places are made often in standardized ways for certain people, by certain people. And I think by suggesting that sometimes things I do look like language, it destabilizes maybe how our idea of language. And also even just maybe seeing these things in public spaces, like what are they trying to sell me? Where do I have to move? You know, language is this thing that's industrialized and put back on us and constantly kind of shouting at us. We're constantly getting these inputs. And then when there's something that's like, it's not telling you what to do or how to behave necessarily, but it's something that is there and maybe is responding to the environment. I think hopefully this, destabilizes this idea of everything being fixed and standardized, and perhaps this, some kind of agency to people who, in the end, a lot of people will end up, designing these things or have possibilities to work within the communities and maybe make things for themselves and for people like them who are not included.
Nice, thank you for sharing that. And I find it interesting when you're talking about like fixed and planning. It's mentioned before, like you said, these are planned environments. You have a way of distorting that, and we've got desired paths. But I think this concept of fixing things goes way further than just the streets that we're in. And I'm curious, Joris, is there such a thing as a desired neighborhood?
Well, we could consider that, yeah. A desire path happens when the infrastructure doesn't tend to the needs or cater to the needs of the users, either the residents or the workers or people who just happen to pass by. So it's a case where the infrastructure doesn't serve the people. So if we extend that to a bigger scale, then we end up, what is a desire street or a desire neighborhood? It's when there is no infrastructure. There is the city isn't there to provide housing, for instance. Therefore, housing appears just like that. And we had the example of Rocinha, the favela in Rio. So those, I like to consider, to see that as an entire desire neighborhood, because it's the entire neighborhood that is informal. It's not just a path. And every single path, street, stairways, and roads, they have become desire neighborhood, even desire cities. If we and then if we expand even bigger, and entire countries, for instance, that have that were formerly colonized, they end up with an entire infrastructure that does not serve the people, the residents, the culture. It doesn't serve the places where people need to go, where people need to move goods. So we might say that then formerly colonized countries, or formerly, well, yeah, still, they end up being entire desire countries where they have to work with an infrastructure that doesn't serve their needs, and whether they're able to provide something, an alternative or not, well, that's the whole issue. But yeah, we can scale it up, and there's always a way, an informal infrastructure.
And are there examples where these desire neighborhoods end up getting codified? I mean, like, okay, this was unofficial, was made in response to a system that doesn't cater to us, but it's so big and so it's been there for so long and it's so powerful. Do they ever get codified or accepted? Or
well, I would say the question is, do we want them to be, and is it desirable that then they become codified in the law by the power, or do we want them to serve the people in a more informal way?
I would say that organized chaos is still organized, right? You still have an organization is just not designed by the state for the benefit of the state. Lucia, as an example, people build on top of each other, but people still manage to navigate their community, their neighborhood. They're still able to get from point A to B, even if someone all of a sudden decides to add another room to their house. They still manage to create a way to get through the community. But I actually wanted to come back on this idea of, do we want to formalize something that has been informal, or how do we look at colonial infrastructures and settler colonial infrastructures in that case, and how they serve the people? Very just to draw a very relevant connection now, if we look at desire paths and desire communities, how people build communities that serve them, we can just look at what's happening in Palestine, right? There are settlements in the West Bank and in Gaza where people have literal segregation on what roads they can use, for example. And they have to make way in a way that it serves them, right? So you have roads where Israelis can use and roads that Palestinians can use. But you also see people making roads or making ways to get from point A to B underground because there's no other way to get on in the infrastructure that's created on top by the colonial infrastructure. So you have to make way with what is informal and what serves the community. So whether you want to codify it or not, I think people will always find a way to serve what makes them not only get from point A to B, but also actually gets them there safely, right? So whether you want to risk the chance of getting bombed or getting struck by a bomb, or you want to make sure that you're safe, you're going to make a way. Same way in the favelas, whether you want to build on top of your house or not with a formal planning or not, you're still going to do that. You're just going to make sure that people can still get from point A to point B.
Interesting. So the whole codifying part of it, it just isn't relevant. It's about whether it's safe, whether it's comfortable, whether it caters to the people there, be it within or without that code. Nice. Thank you for adding that. I'm curious, are there any questions from the audience? You guys have been quiet for a while. Let's shake you up. There's a question right over there.
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering, and this might be definitely because of not having the right knowledge, but we're talking about informal settlements and that it can be a desired path. However, sometimes these informal settlements are also locations where there isn't a lot of services, where people might be building structures that are working for them, but then the government also says, okay, but we are out. How do you relate those two factors to each other, right? Because on one hand, codification is not something that we might want, but it also means that their services aren't being provided, which can lead to all kinds of stuff. So just wondering about that.
Can I?
Go for it,
yeah. Great. So if I'm just gonna talk from a very legal and colonial perspective, because that's what I look at when I teach my students. So from a legal perspective, most former colonies, former colonized spaces were not built for the people who live in there now. So they were never meant to house the particular group of people that have settled there now. So the infrastructures are already not serving them. So they create spaces that are going to serve their needs, not necessarily what the state would want, because even, for example, in a city of like Amsterdam, they don't want working class people in the city center, right? So it's not meant for you to enjoy the city in a way that they envision the city to represent. They envision the city to represent a certain amount of wealth, a certain amount of class, etc., similar to former colonized spaces. So the people who have settled there have already come back from spaces where they were either ostracized or exiled to, and then have come back and have taken ownership of a space that was not designed for them. So they built around the city that was not catering for them. So yes, you have issues around infrastructure, access to water, access to the basic provisions, but that means that either the state still doesn't see citizens as worthy of being in that space, so therefore they're not responding to what they need, or as citizens you take ownership of that space no matter whether the state wants you there or not. So if we're looking at the perspective of how do you create policies that actually respond to creating a space that is able to cater to my need, Janelle's need, Joris's need, people that have not been included in the planning, you would say that, okay, how do you make a city more accessible without actually limiting who is visibly pleasant to see in the city? You don't have that conversation. Unfortunately, that is not a conversation that that happens at all in city planning. The city is designed on the desirability of where the money is coming from, not necessarily of the people that live there.
Which I find interesting because I think that the origin of cities even lies in that, right? Yeah. Cities were made to bring money to a location, but were never
I guess, made for, hey, you should live here and be comfortable. Joris.
Yeah, I think also the idea that the excuse of, oh, there's no money or we can't afford to build this. I think we see with Desire Paths or with Desire Neighborhoods that people find ways. They organize themselves. They build. So that's why I believe that very often it's an excuse. It's because there's already the will and the means to do it. So all the authority could do is simply allow people to do what they would want to do. And even if they don't want to, because sometimes also they're not able to when it's a failing state, when it's a failing administration or whatever, they can't provide for it. But then in that case, what you can do is just allow people to organize themselves, to have agency over how they want to organize their space, because they will do it anyway.
So you need more trust, if I'm hearing this.
Yeah, and a less top-down decision.
Nice. Are there any other questions in the audience? I see I see 3 hands going up. I'm going to go there, and then there, okay?
Fair enough. My question is actually building upon that, giving people the freedom to make those changes. Is how, what is your view on how we can do this urban planning and this urban designing in a way to invite the communities there to actually stimulate that change, to actually give them this canvas to make the changes on, and maybe make these desired paths more accessible to create?
Go for it.
Well, I think that you just have to listen to them. People usually have an opinion on what they want to do and what they want to do with their space. I think there's the example, because Lucia mentioned who the city desires inside the city, and there's the example of sex workers, for instance, in the red light district, who are now in the process of there's going to be a decision that is on Thursday, I believe, on whether the sex workers are allowed in the red light district or if they will be moved into a complex further outside of the city center. And it's really not difficult to figure out what they want, because when you ask them, they have expertise, they experience the space every day, they work in the space, they make the space, they've created culture. Sex workers have been in that area for centuries. So it's not that hard to just listen to what they need, to ask also, what do you need? How can we make your life easier? And how can we facilitate your relationship with the residents, with the tourists, etc. So it's not difficult. It just, there needs to be a paradigm shift in thinking, well, if you're the authority, you're not here to tell people how to live. You're here to ask them, what can we do for you?
I'm curious. Oh, Barbara, go for it.
No, I was just going to add that I think policy making is sometimes centered around quantification and numbers. So you look at policies that reflect sort of numbers, and instead of maybe focusing on quality. And so policies are sometimes designed for the majority rather than the minority. So changing these structures in which you actually invest in small neighborhoods, small interventions, community desires that are necessary, rather than looking at big numbers, big representation, can also lead to like bigger changes as well. Yeah.
I'm curious, Ilke, is there a way that Desire Alliance or that project can act as a vessel to kind of communicate this? Because I think it's an extremely democratic, pulled away from the numbers and existing structures way of communicating how people want to move through space.
I mean, I guess, it's a good question. I think the way I approach this is I'm doing this with my body, kind of in collaboration with the space and the people involved. And, I'm always talking to people and stuff, but I'm doing it essentially with my body in a very analog way and in response to the space. And I think it's more this process of responding directly to a space and so I would do a lot of planning and things, but then you kind of making these movements and things in this moment that's kind of like, there's a pole in the way, so you have to go around it, even though the plan was that it's something like this. So I think it's more kind of the ideas behind it, like, as you say, ask people, talk to people, ask them what they want, these things about like really you're on the ground within it. There's this thing, for instance, in Rotterdam, in the south of Rotterdam, which is like a historically neglected area of the city. City councillors who make decisions on what happens there have never crossed the Maas River to actually be there. So there's this thing of like top down, looking from a distance and looking at numbers and where the money goes, and we're not so interested in the people who not making so much money. And also Rotterdam is planned top down, so it's like this idea, like literally looking architecture that is seeing it from above rather than from inside it. And so it's more kind of these ideas, I think, my work itself, I think it's kind of more a slower thing that you might come across, or it might indicate something, but I think it's never this kind of like didactic thing to solve something. I think the solving is a very big subject that is very good to discuss and needs to be discussed more.
Nice, thanks for adding that. There was a question here a while back, and I want to get to you. Right over here, right in front of me, Purple.
So it's more about kind of going back to flexibility maybe in design and how users react to design. And I kind of wanted to ask, what do you think about, providing flexibility in design, so seeing how users would react to it, but also almost the other side of, do you think some designs maybe try too hard? So, for example, here in Amsterdam, it's amazing, having all these plant pots around, like at the front of a house, there's a bench, all of these kind of really nice natural things that have just occurred from people's needs. And in the UK, I know, there is this kind of idea of romanticizing this aspect, and I've seen projects which try and, create space in front of houses that, people are like, oh, we want to see how the residents use it and how people walking past use it. And I work in architecture, and sometimes, this is seen as, oh, this is amazing, but actually, is it trying really hard, and does it take away from this kind of natural reaction of people by actually, forcing almost people to do something and thinking, oh, we're doing work for the community and including people in this?
I see 3 answers locked and loaded. I would like to go in a little L, starting with you.
Well, one thing that's sort of different to different example, but for examples of spaces where there's no road markings, actually has shown that it works in certain cases, that people actually pay more attention and drive more carefully because there's nothing there. So it's like this thing of totally not having no design, having no road markings. And there's an example of a town in France, apparently they just did lines everywhere in a dangerous area, like very haphazard drawings and markings. And everyone slowed down because they're like, okay, what's going on here? So it is, I think, I don't know, from that perspective, but I think you guys have more also interesting things specifically related to.
Well, I was thinking about front yards, for instance, and I did a video about how, especially in London, typically you have front yards in front of Victorian houses and rows of houses, and most of them are paved over. It's just concrete over. And some people had very negative reactions about it, and like, why do people not care? And if I had the luxury of having a front yard, then I would. But it's like it's not only about providing the space. It's also, do people have the time to tend to a garden? And especially in London, for instance, most residents will be tenants. So that will mean that they're only here for maybe a year or 2, and then the rents will go up and they will have to leave. And then does the tenancy agreement give them access to that front yard? Do they have ownership over it? Are they able to even put their plants there? Sometimes it's easier for a landlord, for instance, to just say, this is nobody's place, so that there's no conflicts, there's nothing to manage and to deal with. So concrete and problem solved. So it's very often not even necessarily the fault of the residents, but it's not only about providing the space, it's also everything around it. Do people there have the time? Are they allowed? Is it in the agreement, in the law of the building, that are they encouraged to do that?
So there's like this different concept again of comfort, where it goes, how comfortable are you, and within what boundaries of that comfort are you able to cater to these extra things?
Yeah, and also, are you allowed to do you have the space to socialize, to be able to have a conversation with your neighbors of how do we manage this space, and do we manage it collectively? Do we find, but in our societies, there's no really room for that. It's already it's going to be stipulated in the tenancy agreement. Are you allowed to do this or not? No, it belongs to the person who lives on the ground floor, and that's it. And if that person happens to not care or not have the time, then well, the entire building has a front yard that is abandoned.
Unused. Interesting. I want to answer one more question that was handed in online to make sure that they're also getting the time and attention that they deserve. And afterwards, we're going to have to move towards the wrap up. The question is, are there any examples of paths or city designs that aren't created for the local communities, but have in some way been reclaimed or reintegrated into their needs?
One of the videos that in Rosinia, for instance, the roads that the entire community sort of was built around already existed before. That was already a connection with two pre-existing neighborhoods, and around that, then the community reclaimed it because it appeared around it. So that would be an example when this time the infrastructure that already existed. It was not designed to serve those people. It was not designed for that, but it still appeared around it.
Nice. That was also a perfect, quick answer. I want to thank everyone so much for raising their hands, for typing their questions into Menti, for providing their input. I want to thank the four of you for responding to these questions, for asking each other's questions, and engaging in this conversation. Tonight, we spoke about desired paths, demand versus desires, and how this affects the individual. I've uncovered things that I would have never thought about before. I mentioned some of them before, but I loved the idea, for example, of comfort tying together kind of the common denominator between desire paths, and how comfort is not the same for everyone, and how that differs over people, and how sometimes your comforts have to fight each other, and you make a choice based on that. I want to thank everyone in this room and online for participating. I want to thank Barbara, Ilke, Joris, and Lucia as well for joining us in this. A massive round of applause for yourself and them. Now I'm going to say something and you guys are all going to respond with, "Aw," okay? We have one last episode left in this fellowship. I love the spontaneity. The last episode of this fellowship is called Borders versus Bodies. It will take place on Monday, the 20th of November. You can sign up for that episode on www.dezwijger.nl. And while you're there, you can also become friends of Pakhuis de Zwijger. Thank you for watching this. And for more info about this program and all recordings, you can go to dezwijger.nl/DCFA, Designing Cities for All. You can have drinks down at the bar. And I wish you all a very, very lovely evening.